Alright, so you're a fan of Vermintide. Or Warhammer. I might even suggest and be so bold as to say you could be a fan of both. And now I've made a video about each of the Uberstrike 5 and their quirks, classes and personalities. And one fateful day, when I sat pondering my orb, I heard a voice whispering, "Psst, what if Vermintide, but from Skaven's perspective?" Now this is clearly a Cinchian scheme, but what the hell? What's the worst that can happen? So you're a Skaven, and let's be very generous, a storm vermin at that. Not the lowest of low, not the highest of high. And you've taken part in countless raids and schemes against the Under Empire's numerous foes. And one day, or however they measure time whilst underground, you get sent along with the never-ending horde of rats to Uberstrike, and more specifically, Helmgard. And with said orders you march off towards another easy victory. Or so you thought. In Warhammer, wars are usually decided by 4 different variables: power, magic, gods, or by numbers. And no faction believes in numbers more than the Skaven. They are the definition of endless, and they exist literally everywhere. Beneath every city, every road and fortress, they multiply endlessly. Their Under Empire is not so much a nation in the traditional manner, but more a force of nature, a cancer that cannot fully be removed. Skaven is an interesting species that might be everywhere at all time and outnumber everyone at least 10 to 1. And so one might ask, how have they not just won? Well, one major reason why they haven't conquered the world is because they more often than not just squabble amongst themselves. However, when they finally do decide to declare war against someone other than themselves, their Graziers don't ask if they would win. They only ask how much each clan is willing to lose. And Vermintide 2 is the story that almost made the Skaven question if it's really worth it after all. So when the end times began and when chaos surged south, the Horned Rat finally took his place among the gods and decided, I want to be on the right side of history, and loosely joined forces with chaos. To understand the Skaven experience of Vermintide, however, we must first understand how the Skaven think. And almost immediately we realize that a single Skaven life has no value. However, the Skaven collectively believe they are inevitable. And this mindset doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It is reinforced by everything they are taught by their overlords. They outnumber every race. They infest every major city. They survive betrayal, plague, starvation and civil war. And since they hear this over and over and over, it is no surprise they have such a superiority complex. And as mentioned earlier, the Graziers preach a brutal truth. Victory is guaranteed as long as enough Skaven die. Uberstrike was meant to be proof of that logic, and Helmgard would be confirmation. The Empire would collapse under sheer pressure, not brilliance. And everything would have gone to plan if it weren't for the pestering 5. More about them later. Now, however, it is time for the Graziers. You see, Skaven don't wage war in a traditional sense, so to speak, and that goes for the Graziers too as generals. They are prophets, politicians and cult leaders rolled into one. Basically, they are very big yappers, and boy do they do a good job at first. And instead of commanding loyalty through honor, they rule through fear, prophecy and selective truth. And what better material to use than warpstone? They use it for everything: executions, failed offensives, entire clans being sacrificed for future advantage. And for a time, it works. Early victories reinforce belief, cities burn, panic spreads, the empire fractures under multiple threats. From a Skaven perspective, Vermintide 2 begins exactly as predicted, which makes what happens next deeply unsettling. You see, the earliest Skaven reports do not describe defeat. Instead, they describe irregularity. For instance, patrols disappear without battle, commanders are killed before orders are given, entire offensives stall without explanation. And this is deeply unnatural for Skaven warfare, because hordes are meant to break resistance by sheer volume alone. I mean, losses are expected, but momentum is just supposed to keep going. And so the Greys here do also what any reasonable leader would do. They dismiss concern and tell their troops everything's fine and going as planned. But when the rank and file notice that something is wrong, then it might be time to actually do something. Because this enemy is not a reactionary force to the Skaven. Oh no, they move with purpose to designated targets. To the Skaven, the Uberstrike 5 are not heroes. They are anomalies. Each one violates an assumption Skaven warfare relies on. The Dwarf invalidates number through firepower. The Elf invalidates leadership through precision. The Witch invalidates faith through terror. The Knight invalidates morale by refusing to break. And the Fifth is always inconsistent, which invalidates prediction itself. Together they do something far worse. They dismantle Skaven structure. And they don't strike like anything else. They cut out one problem at a time with surgical precision, sowing chaos and discord in their ranks. From a Skaven perspective, fighting the Five feels like fighting something that understands you better than you understand yourself. And since there are only 5 of them, and not an entire army, it is hard to pinpoint when and where they will appear next. Will they strike another chieftain? Or destroy some machinery to foil the Greyseer's plan? Only time will tell, and that is what spreads true fear. The fear of not knowing how your enemy will emerge. They're here, they're everywhere. It's the Uberstrike 5, the Skaven's worst nightmare. Skaven accounts describe encounters with the Five not as battles, but as collisions, because in their mind, sending an unending horde of Skaven slaves, clan rats and storm vermin and more to just find piles and piles of bodies isn't something new. However, they usually find some sort of victory in the aftermath. Well, not against the Five. Oh, no. Against them it's just another leader dead, a city cleared, or a screaming bell destroyed. But what to do against such a foe? Well, Greyseers gathered all their intellectual prowess and came up with, clearly chaos is the way forward. The big bad Greyseer during Vermintide decided that chaos would be the best course of action in order to rid them of the pesky Uberstrike 5. Now how he came to this conclusion is beyond me, but I guess they shared the goal of ending the Empire, and that was enough. Now if you know anything about Skaven, it is that they build up over time in secrecy and then strike with overwhelming force, at least for the most part. Chaos, however, well, Chaos don't really do secrecy, at least not during the end times, and especially not Nurgle. I'd argue it's quite easy to spot one of them. They march into war with banners flying high and screaming their war cries aloud, making a huge spectacle of whatever happens to stand in their way, which is like the polar opposite of the Skaven. So from the Skaven point of view, Chaos armies do not coordinate. Their gods demand spectacle, as mentioned earlier, not strategy. Demons slaughter Skaven as readily as humans, although that is not all too different from the Skavens themselves, to be fair. But probably worst of all, Chaos champions draw attention, and attention attracts the Five, and the Five means big problem. Chaos do not strengthen Skaven's plans, it invalidates them. Speaking of the Chaos gods and their belief, Skaven has some kind of belief system of their own. Now in Skaven society, faith in the Horned Rat and his Greyseers is one of the strongest factors in order to keep the masses from scurrying away. But setback after setback decreases the ordinary rat's belief in the Seer's plan, which is very dangerous, because if there is one thing that spreads faster than plague in Skaven society, it's paranoia. So what does the Greyseers do in order to keep the ranks from breaking? Well, if you said public executions, even bloodier rituals, and even vaguer prophecies, you'd be right. Now the regular Skaven deal with a lot of shit, but when clan rats and even Skaven slaves can see a shift in the dynamic, that is when there might be something irregular going on. See, Skaven worships success more than anything, but when the suck is the bigger part in success, then morale starts to waver. And Helmgart was the straw that broke the camel's back. It was supposed to be the moment of truth, a fortress, a choke point, a final overwhelming commitment of force to secure a victory. Instead, the Seers faced a force that was sent to balance the scales. See, the Uberstrike 5 are not champions of order. They are not chosen by gods. They are a balancing force, basically the League of Shadow. And this is the case with everything. When empires overreach, when gods grow too loud, when reality bends too far towards annihilation, something pushes back. Not with armies, but with precision. And from the Skaven perspective, this is horrifying, because it means numbers are no longer enough. And when numbers are no longer enough in Skaven logic, then something is seriously wrong. Now, despite the massive setback at Helmgart, the Under Empire still exists, the Graziers still plan, the Skaven still multiply, but Vermintide 2 leaves them change. More cautious, more suspicious, and more aware that somewhere out in the burning ruins, 5 unpredictable, seeming undefeatable figures are still waiting, and no prophecy accounts for them. And now that we have some understanding for what it feels to be a Skaven during Vermintide, what conclusions can we draw? Well, it's a Skaven tragedy, that's for sure. Vermintide 2 is not a story about heroes defeating monsters. From the Skaven point of view, it is a story about certainty dying. A war that should have been won by numbers alone, undone by 5 people who refused to behave as the world expected. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest lesson of them all.